There are allegations that the reason Ilhan Omar herself was allowed to come to the United States was because of immigration fraud committed by her father.
The fact-checking industry covered up one of Ilhan Omar's darkest secrets, and here's how. Was a high-ranking official in the Siad Barre regime in Somalia. This is a genocidal regime, would have made them coming to America impossible.
Ilhan Omar is suddenly facing a storm of renewed scrutiny as long-buried family mysteries, questionable financial dealings, and resurfacing accusations crash back into the public conversation at the same time. What once appeared to be scattered controversies are now being pieced together by critics into something far more troubling, a shadowy narrative tangled with identity, influence, money, and a history they claim was never fully revealed. And if even a fraction of what investigators and commentators are now revisiting proves accurate, the fallout wouldn't just bruise reputations in Washington. It could trigger consequences that shake her political future to its core.
She married her brother, allegedly, so that he could get into the country and be here, like an immigration matter. Trump keeps saying that she married her brother so she could get in. That's not it. She was already in. She was brought in by her dad when she was young, under 18. But she did reportedly, allegedly, marry her own brother so that he could come into the country, and then divorced him and got remarried to her own ex-husband, I think is how it went, because this is all a fraud to get her brother here.
For years, Omar has carefully cultivated a powerful personal narrative, the story of an outsider, a refugee who defied impossible odds, a politician who positioned herself as an unflinching voice against corporate dominance, entrenched elites, and what she often called the deep contradictions of American power. That identity wasn't accidental. It was shaped deliberately, repeated everywhere, and became a cornerstone of her political strength. Now, critics say they are tearing that narrative apart from every possible angle. Pieces of her personal history are being pulled back into the spotlight, raising questions that some argue were never fully answered in the first place. At the same time, her financial picture is suddenly being scrutinized in ways that appear sharply at odds with the anti-establishment message she built her reputation on. Meanwhile, long-circulating accusations are resurfacing with renewed intensity, and some commentators claim powerful media outlets quietly shielded her during the moments when scrutiny should have been the most relentless. The real risk, however, isn't any single allegation standing by itself. The more serious threat is the growing narrative shift, a transformation from reformer to someone critics say may have quietly benefited from the very system she spent years publicly attacking.
Ours that were brought or came to America under a refugee program. It gave them special ability to enter the U.S. and to have their pathway to citizenship. And that was presuming that they were not serving in the military or the genocidal military of the country which they came from. It turns out that that was actually the case. This was something that was buried by the so-called fact-checking industry and the mainstream media.
Before going hard, the verified ground matters. Omar is Somali-born, arrived in the United States in 1995 after years inside a Kenyan refugee camp, became a naturalized citizen, and now sits in Congress. The Associated Press reported that House Oversight Chair James Comer sought financial records tied to companies partially owned by her husband after. Their disclosed value jumped sharply between 2023 and 2024. AP also confirmed there is currently no evidence of wrongdoing by Omar herself. Some parts of this story are documented, others remain disputed, but the pressure is completely real regardless of where each individual piece eventually lands.
And this story of corruption, not the daycares, that interesting, you guys. Nobody has been clamoring for daycare from the Somali neighborhoods, saying our daycares are getting shut down because they weren't daycares. And you see all of this really shady business dealings here from Ilhan Omar. The attention on Minnesota.
And this is where the situation suddenly turns explosive. The spark behind this entire surge of scrutiny isn't some dusty rumor pulled from years past. It's the money. Fresh reporting from the Associated Press points to two companies tied to her husband, EST Crew and Rose Lake Capital, whose combined disclosed value has reportedly climbed by at least $5.9 million. And then the story becomes even more pointed. During an on-camera exchange, a reporter pressed Omar with a blunt question. How did her financial picture transform so dramatically from a negative net worth of roughly $65,000 before entering Congress to more than $30 million within just 7 years? Instead of offering a detailed explanation, she declined to elaborate, leaving the question hanging in the air.
Serious public concerns about how your business has increased so dramatically in value only a year after reporting very limited assets. Omar contends she did nothing wrong and says her wealth came from her husband. House Oversight Committee began the initial probe into the couple, an atypical move given that the House Ethics Committee usually handles allegations involving lawmakers and their families.
She pointed to public disclosures and walked away. Then, when pressed specifically about the ESD crew described in those disclosures as a winery, the reporter noted there is no verifiable phone number, no confirmed physical location, and no functioning public presence for this business. Omar's response was to question whether the reporter actually reads things. Voters do not study valuation footnotes. They see confrontations like that one, and they draw their own conclusions. In politics, perception is brutal. The issue is never only whether something is illegal. The issue is whether it looks clean.
He exposed Ilhan Omar's winery for not having a physical location or any way to purchase wines online, despite them having a very high net worth of $5 million. But this right here is massive.
I walked by every single office in this building, and everyone has their logos proudly displayed on the wall. I asked around for Rose Lake Capital, and people were not familiar with it. I looked at every logo, and Rose Lake Capital did not have it.
Attention quickly shifts toward her husband's business dealings, because that's precisely where the reported spike in valuation appears to originate. When companies linked to a lawmaker's spouse suddenly climb in value at the same time that the politician's national influence is expanding, critics inevitably begin asking hard questions. Did political visibility play a role? Did connections, proximity to power, or elite circles help fuel that financial rise? What began as a conversation about wealth is now morphing into something bigger, a debate about access itself. In Washington, access is often considered the most powerful currency of all. The public has watched this storyline unfold many times before. A politician champions bold principles in public while, behind the scenes, private relationships quietly flourish and profit. Whether anything like that occurred here remains unproven. But the perception alone has cracked the door wide open, and critics are already stepping through it without hesitation.
Ilhan Omar claims that she obtained her citizenship when her father was naturalized in 2000, just months before her 18th birthday. But there's a problem. No record has been found of his naturalization paperwork. In response to a FOIA request for her father's N-400 paperwork filed by A.J. Kern in June of 2023, the National Records Center was unable to locate any filings under his name.
Once the finance story cracked open the scrutiny, critics pulled everything else off the shelf immediately. Marriage allegations, family background disputes, identity questions, past statements on race, old media battles. This is exactly how political scandal operates. A fresh trigger creates the opening. Archival, retrieval begins. Controversies start stacking on top of each other. The entire moral brand gets reframed from the ground up. The moment the politician looks vulnerable, every unresolved question from the past stops being background noise and becomes active ammunition fired in real time.
Is that Ilhan Omar's father was a colonel in the Siad Barre regime, is a Marxist-Leninist regime responsible for genocide of a neighboring tribe, and he was a senior official in that very regime.
The Somalia layer is where this story moves far beyond Washington drama. Critics argue that Omar's full story cannot be understood without examining Somalia's brutal political history under the Sedbear military regime. Some biographical sources describe her father as having served as a colonel in the Somali army during that era. Snopes has noted that no evidence currently establishes that her father personally committed war crimes.
He denied association with that government and claimed he was trying to escape it.
He cast himself as a so-called teacher trainer. This was the term that kept coming up. I've never heard this term before, teacher trainer. Sometimes it was educator, and it was denied by him. It was a idea that was spread by her as well. But most of the heavy lift.
But the real battle unfolding here isn't centered on what could be proven beyond doubt inside a courtroom. The struggle is over something far more volatile. What details may have been quietly minimized, gently reframed, or carefully omitted from the life story that helped launch a powerful political career in America. That is where the true tension lies. The question exploding into the public conversation isn't simply whether critics have the right to raise these issues. The deeper question is whether the past was ever confronted with full honesty, or whether uncomfortable chapters were quietly pushed aside, replaced by a cleaner, more compelling narrative crafted for an American audience eager to believe it.
On some very obscure Minnesotan outlet whose own reporter that made this claim was later sued for misreporting, and that claim became the basis for this entire notion that what they had said was misinformation, that in fact he was a colonel in the Siad Barre regime and not a so-called teacher trainer as she and the rest of the media.
Then comes the fact check war, and this is where the story stops being about Omar alone. Critics argue that mainstream fact-checkers aggressively shut down legitimate discussion around these controversies for years. PolitiFact acknowledged that local reporting on the brothers' marriage allegation was not conclusive. Snopes said the available evidence was not definitive enough to settle the claim. Omar has denied it. But here is the real issue underneath all of that. Modern politics is not just a war over facts. It is a war over permission. The side that controls what gets labeled as misinformation controls which questions are even allowed to exist publicly.
A quote-unquote racist conspiracy theory, you can't talk about it, but the fact remains her father was in the military, was a high-ranking official, and this was reported by multiple news outlets. Despite that, none of the fact-checking sites like Snopes and PolitiFact, which shut down this claim as a conspiracy theory, nor the mainstream media ever went back to re-examine or re-report.
Label something racist, dismiss it as a conspiracy, declare the matter closed, and suddenly the deeper question becomes radioactive in political conversation overnight. Even when fact-checkers may have been technically correct in their narrow conclusions, the damage to their credibility can still be enormous if audiences feel those verdicts were protecting a politically favored figure. A fact-check can be logically defensible on paper and still trigger a political disaster in the court of public opinion. Because once people suspect the referee is leaning to one side, every future whistle starts to feel questionable. When it comes to the marriage allegation, the responsible stance isn't to treat it as confirmed, because it hasn't been proven. But there is a political reality that cannot be ignored. Whether the claim is ultimately true or completely false, it never actually disappeared. It endured through every denial. It survived every fact check. It pushed past every attempt to shut the conversation down. And each time scrutiny around her intensifies, the allegation surfaces all over again. That persistence alone has become its own political fact, one that no carefully worded statement can permanently wipe away.
sure you guys remember where she covered that really sketchy, ridiculous winery situation. The one where they claim a $5 million valuation, but clearly no one was actually making wine at all. Well, it looks like Angela Rose just went to Washington, D.C. to investigate Tim Mynette's other business, Rose.
Now pull back for a moment and look at everything that critics say is landing on the table at the exact same time. A reported $5.9 million surge in assets. A winery listed in federal disclosures that journalists say they have struggled to physically locate. Business operations tied to her husband have drawn the attention of congressional investigators. Questions are being raised again about her father's past military record. A marriage allegation that, despite repeated denials, continues to resurface. A State of the Union moment that instantly turned her into a national punchline across political media. And a massive fraud scandal in Minnesota worth billions that opponents claim has poisoned the broader political environment in the region. Individually, any one of these controversies might be politically survivable, but when they begin stacking together, they stop looking like isolated incidents. The dynamic changes entirely when separate controversies start echoing each other, creating a narrative critics say is far harder to contain.
Claiming to manage $60 billion, operating out of a WeWork mailbox. No office, no employees.
The financial surge sparks suspicion. Her husband's companies trigger new questions about proximity to influence. Old accusations return, this time louder and harder to ignore. Debates surrounding her father's past ignite again with renewed intensity. Fact-checkers suddenly find themselves accused of shielding the story rather than clarifying it. The media narrative itself begins to splinter in full public view. And in that moment, the conversation shifts. It is no longer centered on whether any single claim can be proven true or false. Instead, the focus moves to a far more unsettling question. Was the public story incomplete from the very beginning? That is the turning point in any political scandal. The moment when it stops being routine damage control and starts to feel like the ground beneath the entire narrative is collapsing.
There's a perception that Americans old enough, they remember the old Jimmy Stewart, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Yes,
it's like, Boy Scout leader wants to save the country. Well, now you have these people that show up with very little personal wealth, and then they, in just a matter.
What makes this situation hit harder than a routine political controversy is the role Ilhan Omar occupies within America's ongoing culture war. She is not some quiet backbencher fading into the background while a few critics murmur complaints. She stands directly at the crossroads of immigration debates, religious identity, racial politics, progressive activism, media battles, and the lingering tensions of the Donald Trump era. All of those fault lines collide in one place, around her. To her supporters, Omar symbolizes resilience, proof that someone can rise from extraordinary hardship to national political power. But to her fiercest critics, she represents something entirely different, a symbol of what they see as a system that protects its own, shields controversy, and refuses accountability. That is exactly why every accusation, every rumor, every question connected to her explodes far beyond its original size. Even a small spark around her name has the power to ignite a much larger political firestorm.
If fraud was involved in her father's alleged naturalization, then her citizenship could be on the chopping block because that would be immigration fraud by the dad that would affect her, and that would be a political earthquake, Dave Smith.
The opposition strategy here is not random outrage, and it never was. Critics are executing for simultaneous moves. Challenge her biography, attack her ethics brand using the finance story as the entry point, frame mainstream media as her institutional shield, then fold her individual story into a much larger democratic hypocrisy narrative. That combination is deliberately designed so that no single front is individually survivable when all four are burning at the same time.
Clearly warrants further investigation, because if this all bears out and we have the evidence, we now know that this is actually the case. And the other twist here is that I don't think this is the end of the story regarding her father. I still think there's more out there. I'm working on it right now. I'm hunting down the facts, but I don't think it ends with the so-called his just being a colonel. I think there was much more going on.
Omar's spokesperson called the oversight inquiry a political stunt and a smear campaign. Maybe it is. Maybe selective targeting is absolutely part of the motivation, but politically, the visual is identical either way. Pressure goes in, and denunciation comes out without a detailed rebuttal attached. When a public figure moves instantly from explanation to accusation, observers read that as vulnerability, regardless of what the underlying truth actually is. The old corruption model was a paper bag full of cash. The new model is cleaner, more worked, more respectable, and much harder to explain in a single headline. That is exactly what makes it more dangerous.
Didn't investigate that at all, even though it was publicly available information. They just had their claim, calling this misinformation, attaching it to so-called Islamophobia, when in reality it was true. And then what happened is you had this cascade from Snopes. You had PolitiFact making the same claim based on the Snopes claim, based on that one article by his local city pages, Minnesota Now.
A politician can survive individual allegations. A politician can sometimes survive a formal investigation. What becomes exponentially harder to survive is a legitimacy erosion cycle where disputed biography, suspicious financial optics, media distrust, and repeated explanation gaps all feed each other in a continuous loop. The legal threshold here may still be completely untouched, but the legitimacy threshold is where the real war is being fought right now. And that war is already well underway. Maybe every disputed piece in this story has a perfectly innocent explanation, but politically, that is no longer the central point. The shield is cracking. What used to be dismissed instantly is now being relitigated loudly in public. The numbers triggered it. The old controversies fed it. The camera confrontations amplified it. And once that process begins, it almost never gets smaller. It gets uglier. The burden now sits entirely on her camp to rebuild what is visibly eroding in front of an audience that is watching every move and no longer willing to simply look away. So, here's the question. Nobody in Washington seems willing to answer directly. If everything about the story is completely clean, why do so many pieces of it still feel unfinished? Drop your thoughts in the comments.